3:15 in the afternoon. The Black Sea. Reach 7-4. A C-17 Globemaster 3 heavy transport was banked into a steep, lumbering turn through 30,000 feet of thin, frozen air. The cargo hold did not contain the usual pallets of rations or heavy vehicles. Instead, it carried a single, lead-lined crate containing the Aegis-X frequency hopper, a prototype quantum-resistant communications module. Whether the crew would deliver the device to its destination in Romania was now a question being decided by the two Su-35 flanker fighters currently bracketed on the transport's wingtips. Below the aircraft, the Black Sea was a bruised, dark purple, its surface obscured by a persistent winter haze that stretched toward the horizon. Inside the cockpit, the air carried the sterile, dry smell of recycled oxygen and the sharp ozone tang of the avionics cooling fans, working at maximum capacity. The United States Air Force intelligence briefing, issued 12 hours before takeoff from Ramstein Air Base, had assessed Russian intercept protocols in this specific sector as strictly observational and non-kinetic. This assessment was the reason Reach 7-4 was flying with only a passive electronic escort and no fighter transition. The Aegis-X frequency hopper was supposed to be the mission's ultimate safeguard. The device was designed to mask the electronic signature of the C-17, making the massive four-engine jet appear on radar as nothing more than a civilian freighter or a pocket of atmospheric clutter. As the aircraft crossed coordinates 44 degrees 20 minutes north, 32 degrees 10 minutes east, the mission commander, Major Elias Thorne, watched the primary flight display with a tightening chest. The signature masking was active, yet the Russian pilots were behaving as if they could see every rivet on the Globemaster's hull. The lead Su-35 performed a violent, high-G barrel roll over the nose of the C-17, the heat from its twin engines shimmering in the cockpit glass. The shockwave of the jet's passage slammed into the transport, causing the entire airframe to shudder. In the cargo bay, the loadmasters felt the floor plates vibrate as the massive aircraft fought the wake turbulence. The Russian pilot was not merely observing, he was actively maneuvering to force the transport off its flight path. Maverick flight. This is Reach 7-4 on guard frequency. Thorne transmitted, his voice steady despite the sweat slicking his palms. We are in international airspace on a cleared flight plan. Your maneuvers are unsafe and unprofessional. Break away immediately. The response was not verbal. Instead, the second Su-35 pulled alongside the cockpit, less than 50 feet from the transport's left wing. The Russian pilot turned his head, his helmeted gaze fixed on Thorne. He slowly raised a gloved hand and pointed downward, toward the heavy cloud deck that hid the Crimean coastline. At that same moment, every screen in the C-17 cockpit flickered. The digital maps distorted, and the radio began to emit a rhythmic, high-pitched screech. The Aegis-X module was not just failing to hide the plane. It appeared to be broadcasting a beacon that the Russian electronic warfare suites were now using to tether the transport's navigation systems. The aircraft's flight computer began to fight Thorne's inputs, the autopilot attempting to roll the ship toward the north, toward the Russian-held airbase at Belbek. We have a primary flight control override, the co-pilot shouted over the electronic screeching. The Aegis-X is slave to an N% external source. They are hacking the fly-by-wire system, Major. We're losing the ability to steer. The C-17 was a giant, but it was a digital giant, and its nervous system was being seized. Outside, the Russian fighters tightened their formation, their wingtips nearly touching the Globemaster's control surfaces. The heavy aircraft began a slow, agonizing descent. The cold air outside the fuselage screamed as the altitude dropped through 20,000 feet. The signature element of the mission, the very technology meant to ensure their invisibility, had become the hook the Russians were using to reel them in. 4:15 in the afternoon, Ramstein Air Base, Germany. The 603rd Air Operations Center was a cavern of blue light, and the low, persistent hum of high-velocity air conditioning. On the main tactical display, a single blue icon designated Reach 7-4 began to deviate from its assigned flight path, pulling away from the Romanian coastline and angling toward the restricted military zones of the Crimean Peninsula. Around the perimeter of the room, analysts in flight suits and service uniforms leaned closer to their terminals, their faces illuminated by the flickering data of the global command and control system. The United States Air Force's in Europe intelligence summary, dated 0 to 4 February 2026, had assessed Russian L-band radar at the Belbek facility as incapable of isolating the quantum encrypted signature of the Aegis-X module. This specific assessment, codified as a Tier 1 intelligence certainty, was the foundation upon which the entire transit mission had been built. According to the document, the Russian military's electronic surveillance network lacked the processing power to distinguish the C-17 Globemaster III from the background noise of the heavy civilian air traffic over the Black Sea. The briefing had stated that even if a visual intercept occurred, the Aegis-X would maintain its ghosting capability, preventing Russian fire control systems from achieving a stable lock. General Bradley Vance, the commanding officer of the Air Operations Center, stood behind the master controller station. The air in the room carried the stale, sterile scent of burnt coffee and floor wax, a sensory hallmark of a command center that had been at high alert for 18 hours. He watched as the telemetry from Reach 7 to 4 began to display critical errors. The transport was no longer answering encrypted satellite communications, and its transponder was broadcasting a distorted, non-standard signal. The Aegis-X is no longer masking the airframe, the technical sergeant at the electronic warfare desk reported, her voice tight. It is doing the opposite. It is acting as an active transponder. Every Russian surface-to-air missile battery from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk is now tracking that aircraft with centimeter-level precision. The Aegis-X frequency hopper was supposed to be the crown jewel of the United States Air Force stealth logistics program. It functioned by generating a localized field of varying frequencies that matched the reflective properties of the surrounding atmosphere. In theory, it was the ultimate cloaking device for non-stealthy aircraft. But the reality unfolding on the screen suggested a catastrophic miscalculation. The Russians had not only identified the frequency hopping pattern, but they had also figured out how to pulse the module from a distance, turning a fragile defensive shield into a homing beacon. General Vance looked at the intelligence summary resting on his console. The words "incapable of isolating" seemed to vibrate with a new, dark significance. The intelligence community had fundamentally underestimated the modernization of Russian electronic warfare suites located at the Belbek airbase. The failure was not one of satellite imagery or human intelligence, but a failure to recognize a leap in signal processing that the Russian forces had likely kept hidden for this exact occasion. The C-17 is descending through 10,000 feet, the sergeant continued. The Su-35 fighters are maintaining a close trail formation. They are shepherding it. If Major Thorne tries to break away, they will have a clear shot within 5 seconds. The room was filled with the sound of rapid typing and the hushed, urgent murmurs of staff officers. The Aegis-X was more than a communications tool. It contained the cryptographic keys for the next decade of North Atlantic Treaty Organization secure transmissions. If that aircraft touched down on a Russian runway, the strategic damage would be measured in decades, not years. The mission was no longer a routine transit. It was a high-stakes recovery operation in which the most sensitive technology in the American arsenal was currently being hand-delivered to the adversary. Vance pressed the toggle for the secure line to the Pentagon. He knew the signature element of this crisis. The very device that was supposed to keep the crew safe was now the primary weapon being used against them. The Aegis-X was a siren, and the Russians were following the song straight to the prize. "Get the National Security Council on the line," Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone. "Tell them the 0 to 4 assessment was wrong. Tell them the Russians have the hook in, and they are pulling hard." 4:32 in the afternoon, the northern sector of the Black Sea, Reach 7 to 4 was no longer flying a mission. It was being towed through the sky by an invisible electronic tether. The C-17 Globemaster III descended through 8,000 feet, the air thickening and the gray-white ceiling of the cloud deck rushing up to meet the cockpit glass. The two Su-35 fighters remained locked. In a tight echelon formation, their proximity so absolute that Major Elias Thorne could see the individual rivets on the Russian jet's vertical stabilizers. The acrid smell of hot electrical insulation began to fill the flight deck, a byproduct of the Aegis-X frequency hopper drawing excessive power, as it attempted to counter the Russian jamming. In the rear of the aircraft, the loadmasters reported that the lead-lined crate containing the module was vibrating with such intensity that it strained the heavy-duty nylon tie-down straps. The signature element of the aircraft, the very system designed to protect it, was now locked in a feedback loop with the Russian ground-based Krasuka-4 electronic warfare systems located on the Crimean coast. We are attempting a hard reset of the flight control computers, the co-pilot, Captain Sarah Miller, announced, her fingers dancing across the center console. If we can cut the link to the Aegis-X, we might regain manual steering. Do it, Thorne commanded, his boots braced against the rudder pedals as he felt the aircraft resist his every input. If we don't break this descent in the next 3 minutes, we are going to be on the ground at Belbek. The tactical reality contradicted the 603rd Air Operations Center assessment provided during the pre-flight briefing. That document had explicitly stated that Russian electronic warfare units lacked the capability to inject malicious code into United States Air Force flight management systems via the Aegis-X interface. However, the physical reality inside the cockpit proved otherwise. The primary flight displays flickered through, a series of rapid, nonsensical altitude readings, and the control sticks, the side sticks that should have been responsive and light, grew heavy and sluggish, as if the hydraulic fluid had turned to lead. Outside the fuselage, the temperature was a bitter -15 degrees Celsius. But inside the cockpit, the crew was sweating through their flight suits. The Su-35 on the left wing dipped its nose, its pilot using the aircraft's wake turbulence to physically shove the C-17 further into a bank. This was a sophisticated display of precision flying, designed to overwhelm the transport's automated flight protection systems. Every time Thorne attempted to level the wings, the Russian fighter's proximity triggered an automated collision avoidance alarm, which in turn forced the C-17's computer to dive away from the perceived threat. Reset failed, Miller shouted, her voice tight with the effort of fighting the interface. The Aegis-X has established a master-slave relationship with the flight control bus. It's not just a communications module anymore, it's the pilot. The transport plunged into the cloud deck. The world outside the windows turned a uniform, blinding white, stripping the crew of their visual references. They were flying on instruments that they no longer trusted, guided by an adversary they could not see, toward a destination that meant the doled end of their careers and the compromise of a decade of American military secrets. The Globemaster shuddered as it hit a pocket of unstable air, the massive wings flexing upward. Prepare the emergency destruction protocols for the module, Thorne ordered, knowing the loadmasters would need to use thermite charges to melt the Aegis-X before landing. If we touch down, that crate has to be nothing but a puddle of slag. The Russian fighters did not break away as they entered the clouds. They stayed exactly where they were, their radar-locked tones a continuous, mocking drone in the American pilots' headsets. The trap was not merely a physical one, it was a total digital eclipse. The C-17 was falling toward the Earth at 300 knots, and for the first time in the history of the Globemaster program, the pilot was a passenger in his own cockpit. 4:48 in the afternoon. The Russian-controlled airfield at Belbek, Crimea. The wheels of Reach 7-4 slammed onto the concrete runway with a violent, bone-jarring impact that sent a shudder through the entire 300,000-pound airframe. This was not a controlled flare executed by a pilot. It was a forced touchdown dictated by the fly-by-wire override. The United States Air Force transport had been guided onto the tarmac by a precision landing signal transmitted directly from the Russian ground station, a capability that the 603rd Air Operations Center intelligence staff had formally assessed as non-existent within the Russian military's inventory. The Globemaster screeched as its heavy-duty tires smoked against the runway, the anti-lock braking system pulsing not under the command of Major Thorne, but under the direction of the hijacked flight computer. The two Su-35 fighters that had escorted the transport down broke formation only at the last possible second, pulling into steep, thundering vertical climbs that shook the cockpit glass of the American jet. As the aircraft slowed to a crawl, Thorne pulled back on the throttles, but the engines remained at a high idle, the digital interface refusing to allow the crew to shut down. The four Pratt & Whitney turbofans. Outside the windows, the Russian response was methodical. A column of BTR-80 armored personnel carriers and olive-drab fuel trucks surged from the perimeter hangars, moving into pre-planned positions to box the aircraft in. At least 60 Russian naval infantry soldiers, armed with AK-12 rifles and wearing modern Ratnik ballistic gear, fanned out across the concrete, their weapons leveled at the C-17's cockpit and crew doors. The air outside was thick with the smell of burning rubber and the high-pitched whine of the Russian armored vehicles' diesel engines. High-pitched whine of the Russian armored vehicles' diesel engines. The Aegis-X frequency hopper in the cargo bay was now emitting a low, rhythmic pulse that hummed through the deck plates. The lead-lined crate had become a homing beacon for the Russian technical teams, who were already approaching. The aircraft with specialized electronic monitoring equipment. The signature element of the mission was no longer a secret to be protected. It was a bright, screaming target that had led the crew into the heart of a hostile fortress. "We have lost all authority over the mission computer," Captain Miller reported, her voice flat with the clinical detachment of a pilot who has realized the controls are dead. "The ground station has locked the cargo ramp and the crew entry door. We are sealed inside our own aircraft." This level of external control over a United States Air Force strategic asset was the physical refutation of every briefing the crew had received before departure. The intelligence report had stated that Russian cyber warfare capabilities were limited to denial-of-service attacks and rudimentary spoofing. The reality of a full, remote seizure of a hardened military flight bus was a gap in understanding that now left the crew trapped. In the rear of the aircraft, the loadmasters were frantically attempting to bypass the electronic locks on the emergency destruction kits. They needed to place the thermite charges directly onto the Aegis-X module, but the automated security system reprogrammed by the Russian signal had engaged the fire suppression locks, preventing any flammable material from being activated. The aircraft's own safety protocols were being used as a cage to preserve the technology for its captors. Major Thorne looked out at the Russian commander standing on the tarmac. The officer was not wearing a mask. He looked up at the cockpit with a calm, professional curiosity, as if he were waiting for a delivery. The Russian forces did not rush the plane. They did not fire. They simply waited, knowing that the digital walls they had built around Reach 7-4 were impenetrable from the inside. "They aren't just here for the plane," Thorne whispered, his hand resting uselessly on the dead control stick. "They're here for the architecture. They've been waiting for us to bring the Aegis-X exactly to this coordinate." The silence on the flight deck was absolute, broken only by the hum of the avionics and the distant, muffled shouting of the Russian soldiers forming a perimeter. The C-17, the most capable transport in the world, sat paralyzed on the Crimean concrete. The mission had reached its lowest point, and the cost of the intelligence failure was now measured in the ticking seconds before the Russian engineers forced the doors. 5:15 in the afternoon. The Belbek tarmac. The interior of Reach 7-4 had transformed from a high-tech transport into a pressurized tomb of steel and composite materials. While the Russian military electronic warfare units maintained their digital stranglehold on the aircraft's mission computer, the crew of 7 remained barricaded behind the armored flight deck door and the reinforced bulkhead of the cargo compartment. The air within the cabin was growing heavy, the carbon dioxide scrubbers failing as the external power management system was slowly systematically dismantled. by Russian engineers working from a mobile terminal less than 40 feet from the nose gear. Outside, the perimeter was absolute. 65 Russian naval infantrymen had established a three-ring security cordon around the C-17 Globemaster III. The first ring consisted of marksmen in the prone position. Their AK-12 rifles, equipped with thermal optics and suppressed barrels, fixed on every visible window and sensor port. The second ring comprised three BTR-80 armored personnel carriers, their 30mm autocannons tracked to the aircraft's wing-mounted fuel tanks. A silent, lethal promise that any attempt at a forced takeoff would result in an immediate horizontal inferno. The third ring was composed of technical specialists from the Russian Signal Intelligence Directorate, who were currently deploying portable masts and dish antennas to further isolate the Aegis-X frequency hopper. Inside the cargo hold, Technical Sergeant Marcus Vance and Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, the two loadmasters, worked in the dim, red glow of the emergency lighting. The Aegis-X module, still secured in its lead-lined crate, was no longer just vibrating. It was generating a heat signature that was beginning to melt the plastic coating on the nearby tie-down straps. The smell of scorched polymer and ionizing air was thick enough to taste. The intelligence brief from the 603rd Air Operations Center had assessed the Aegis-X as having a self-correcting safety shutoff. In the event of a signal hijack, Vance whispered, his voice cracking with exhaustion. The physical reality was the opposite. The module was not shutting down. It was being forced into an overclocked state by the Russian signal, turning the classified hardware into a radio frequency furnace. The loadmasters had tried 3 times to manually activate the thermite destruction charges, but each time, the digital firing pins were countermanded by the aircraft's own safety bus, which now viewed the crew as an internal threat. On the flight deck, Major Elias Thorne watched through the narrow slit of the cockpit window as a Russian officer in a black beret approached the crew entry door. The officer carried a ruggedized tablet and was accompanied by 2 technicians lugging a heavy, shielded cable. They weren't going to blow the door, they were going to talk to it. They were preparing to hardwire into the external maintenance port, a move that would give them physical access to the aircraft's core encryption keys without having to bypass the wireless firewalls. They are going after the physical bus, Captain Miller said, her hand resting on the grip of her M9 service pistol. Once they plug in that cable, the Aegis-X encryption becomes transparent. They'll have every North Atlantic Treaty Organization frequency for the next 5 years. The United States Air Force had spent $3 billion developing the Aegis-X to prevent exactly this scenario. Yet the signature element of the mission was now the very crowbar the Russians were using to pry open the most secure networks in the Western world. The crew was trapped in a paradox. They were the only ones who could destroy the tech, but the tech had been turned into a shield to protect itself from them. We have to go manual, Thorne decided, his eyes fixed on the Russian technicians. If we can't burn it from the inside, we need someone to break it from the outside.
Negative, General.
3,000 miles away, at Ramstein Air Base, the decision had already been made. The time for diplomatic cables and hotline negotiations had passed the moment the Russian technicians began unfurling that shielded cable. The mission had shifted from a forced landing to a kinetic recovery. The United States Navy destroyer, the USS Carney, was already moving into a firing position in the central Black Sea, and a specialized team of Marine raiders was loitering in a C-130 Hercules just outside the Russian radar envelope. The silence inside Reach 7-4 was about to be shattered. The crew sat in the dark, listening to the rhythmic metallic tapping of the Russian technicians against the fuselage, the sound of the lock being picked by an adversary who knew exactly what they were looking for. 5:28 in the afternoon. The Belbek tarmac. The concrete beneath the nose gear of Reach 7-4 erupted in a vertical fountain of white-hot magnesium and pulverized stone, before the sound of the arrival even reached the cockpit. The impact shredded the 2 Russian technical vehicles parked near the wingtip, sending jagged fragments of steel and glass whistling through the air at supersonic speeds. One of the Russian BTR-80 armored personnel carriers was lifted 6 inches off the ground by the overpressure, its heavy tires shredding, and its turret snapping backward as the blast wave punched through its light armor. This was the arrival of the first Tomahawk cruise missile, which had entered the airfield's perimeter at a height of only 20 feet, traveling at 500 knots. The missile had been launched 3 minutes and 12 seconds earlier from the Mark 41 vertical launch system aboard the destroyer DDG-64, the USS Carney, stationed 150 miles away in the central Black Sea. The weapon had used a terrain-following radar path that exploited the same electronic blind spots created by the Russian jamming network. The launch had been a violent, thunderous event, the missile's solid fuel booster kicking it into the sky in a pillar of orange flame and a thick, chemical-smelling cloud of white smoke before the turbojet ignited for the low-level ingress. Inside the cockpit of the C-17, Major Elias Thorne was thrown violently against his shoulder harness as the shockwave slammed into the fuselage. His head snapped to the side, his helmet striking the window frame with a dull metallic crack. To his left, Captain Miller was shoved into the center console, her hands flying up to protect her face, as the cockpit glass flexed inward but held. The smell of burnt ozone from the Aegis-X was suddenly replaced by the overwhelming, acrid stink of high explosives and vaporized fuel. Outside, the Russian naval infantrymen who had been standing in the open were thrown to the ground like discarded dolls, their formations shattered by the sudden, terrifying transition from a standoff to a kinetic engagement. The airfield was instantly transformed into a landscape of orange fire and drifting black soot. A second Tomahawk struck the primary radar mast 300 yards away, the structure folding in on itself in a slow-motion tangle of girders and cables. The rhythmic tapping of the Russian technicians against the hull had stopped. In its place was the roar of secondary explosions as the Russian fuel trucks caught fire. The Aegis-X frequency hopper in the cargo bay responded to the chaos with a final, piercing electronic shriek that resonated through the floor plates before its internal cooling fans finally ceased, the module beginning to melt its own lead-lined housing. "The perimeter is broken," Thorne shouted, his voice sounding thin and distant in his own ears due to the pressure change. The USS Carney just punched the clock. The intelligence assessment from the 603rd Air Operations Center had stated that any surface-to-surface strike against Belbek would be detected and intercepted by the Russian S-400 missile batteries at a range of 40 miles. This prediction was now visibly and violently incorrect. The Tomahawks had not been detected until the moment of impact because the Russian radar operators had been so focused on maintaining the electronic tether to the Aegis-X that they had inadvertently filtered out the low-altitude, high-speed signatures of the incoming American missiles. The signature element of the mission, the frequency hopper, had become a two-edged sword. It had trapped the transport, but it had also blinded the very defenders who were trying to harvest its secrets. As the smoke from the first impacts began to bank against the side of the aircraft, the crew heard a new sound through the roar of the fires. It was the high-pitched, rhythmic thrum of MH-60 Sierra helicopters. Were coming in low under the smoke deck, following the path of the missiles. The recovery had moved from the digital realm to the physical, and the cost of the ground was already being paid in fire and Russian steel. Major Thorne wiped a smear of blood from his forehead and looked at the cargo monitor. The Aegis-X was glowing on the thermal camera, a white-hot coal in the center of the plane. They had a window of 3 minutes before the Russian forces recovered from the shock and began to fire. Back at the transport itself, the siege of Reach 7-4 was over, but the battle for the Crimean tarmac had only just begun. 5:32 in the afternoon. The Belbek tarmac. The two MH-60 Sierra helicopters descended through the thick, oily black smoke of the burning fuel trucks, their rotor wash whipping the fire into a horizontal frenzy. The aircraft did not land. They hovered at 40 feet, their door-mounted M240 machine guns spitting steady rhythms of tracers into the Russian tree line. and the remains of the hangar complex. From the open cabin doors, heavy nylon fast ropes were kicked out, uncoiling through the heat-distorted air like striking snakes. Within 4 seconds, 12 operators from the Marine Raider Regiment were on the ground, their boots hitting the scorched concrete with disciplined precision. The Marine Raiders moved in a violent, synchronized flow, their M4 carbines suppressed, the sound of their fire nothing more than a series of metallic clicks against the backdrop of the roaring fires. They did not engage in a prolonged firefight. They moved directly for the crew entry door of Reach 7-4. The lead operator, Gunnery Sergeant Silas Vance, placed a small, focused, cutting charge against the external maintenance port where the Russian technicians had tried to interface. The explosion was small, a sharp crack that shattered the digital lock without compromising the structural integrity of the airframe. Breach! 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 The radio crackled in Major Thorne's headset. The crew door of the C-17 Globemaster 3 hissed open, the internal pressure equalizing with the smoke-filled atmosphere of the Crimean airfield. The raiders surged up the narrow stairs, their weapon lights cutting through the red emergency glow of the flight deck. At the same moment, a second team of 6 operators moved into the cargo bay, heading for the Aegis-X frequency hopper. The signature element of the mission, the frequency hopper, was now a hazard. The lead-lined crate was glowing a dull, angry cherry red, and the air around it shimmered with the intense heat of a localized electronic meltdown. The intelligence brief from the 603rd Air Operations Center had assessed that the Aegis-X would remain structurally stable for up to 2 hours following a signal hijack. This assessment was now proven wrong by the cooling slag at the base of the unit. The Russian pulse had not just jammed the device, it had caused a catastrophic thermal runaway in the quantum processing core. "We have the crew," Gunnery Sergeant Vance reported, as his team escorted Thorne and Miller toward the door. "But the package is non-recoverable. It is melting through the deck plates." Negative on the abandonment. The command frequency from the USS Carney cut in. "The core must be neutralized. Use the Mark 7 disposal charges. Do not leave a single chip for the recovery teams." Outside, the Russian response was regaining its momentum. From the far end of the runway, 2 T-90S tanks were slewing their turrets toward the transport, their 125mm smoothbore guns searching for a target through the smoke. The Marine Raiders on the perimeter began launching 40mm smoke grenades to mask the aircraft, but the heat signature of the burning fuel made thermal masking impossible. In the cargo hold, the disposal team worked with frantic, sweating precision. They placed 4 Mark 7-shaped charges directly onto the glowing skin of the Aegis-X module. The heat was so intense it began to blister the paint on the operator's gloves. The clock was no longer measured in minutes, but in the seconds it would take for the Russian tanks to find their range. "Crew is clear. Charges are set," Vance shouted over the roar of a nearby secondary explosion. The 12 raiders and the 7 crew members of Reach 7-4 sprinted across the concrete toward the hovering helicopters. The air was a chaotic mix of salt spray, jet fuel, and the sharp, metallic scent of high-velocity rounds snapping through the air. One raider was struck in the shoulder by a fragment of concrete kicked up by a Russian machine gun, the impact spinning him around before his teammates hauled him toward the landing skid of the MH-60 Sierra. As the first helicopter pulled into a steep, banking climb, the disposal team triggered the remote detonator. Inside the cargo bay of the C-17, the 4 charges fired simultaneously. There was no massive fireball. Instead, a focused beam of white-hot plasma punched through the Aegis-X core, vaporizing the classified circuits and turning the $5 billion module into a useless lump of fused silicon and lead. The transport, once the pride of the United States Air Force Strategic Fleet, sat crippled and abandoned on the Belbek tarmac. Its mission a failure, but its secrets finally, violently erased. The helicopters accelerated to 140 knots, staying mere feet above the wavetops as they fled the Crimean coast, leaving behind a landscape of fire and the shattered remnants of a technology that should have never been there. 5:45 in the afternoon. 12 miles off the Crimean coast. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters screamed across the wavetops at an altitude of less than 20 feet, their belly panels slick with the salt spray of the Black Sea. Behind them, the Crimean coastline was a jagged silhouette of rising black smoke and the rhythmic, terrifying flashes of Russian anti-aircraft batteries attempting to find a track through the clutter. The pilots were flying in a tight, staggered formation, their night vision goggles rendering the world in a high-contrast, emerald-green blur of white-capped water and dark sky. Inside the lead helicopter, the air was a chaotic mix of the high-pitched whine of the high-pitched whine, twin General Electric engines, and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the main rotor blades. Major Elias Thorne sat on the floor of the cabin, his back against the transmission housing, watching the corpsman work on the wounded Marine Raider. The operator had taken a jagged piece of concrete to the shoulder. The wound was messy, the blood appearing black under the green light of the cabin, but the pressure bandage was holding. The smell of copper, sweat, and salt air filled the cramped space, a sensory reminder of the thin line between the mission's failure and their survival. "We have inbound signatures." The co-pilot's voice cut through the compound. Intercom, calm but strained. Russian S-400 battery at Sevastopol is in search mode. They are looking for the hole in the smoke. The United States Navy destroyer, the USS Carney, was still providing active electronic cover, its AN/SPY-1 radar operating in a high-gain jamming mode to saturate the Russian sensors. However, the signature element of the crisis, the Aegis-X frequency hopper, was no longer there to provide the ghosting capability the intelligence teams had relied upon. The 603rd Air Operations Center assessment had stated that a helicopter extraction would be low risk, following a cruise missile strike. This was the final, bitter error of the 0-4 intelligence summary. Without the Aegis-X, the helicopters were massive, radar targets against the flat surface of the sea. "Rendezvous in 4 minutes," the pilot announced. "Look for the Hercules." Through the spray-streaked windows, a dark shape materialized out of the haze. It was a KC-130J Super Hercules. Its refueling drogues already trailed out like long, skeletal fingers. The logistics of the extraction required an immediate mid-air refueling to reach the safety of Turkish airspace. The helicopters, pushed to their maximum fuel consumption during the high-speed dash from the tarmac, were running on less than 800 pounds of fuel, barely enough to stay airborne for another 15 minutes. The connection was a violent mechanical struggle. The lead MH-60 bucked in the wake turbulence of the somber, larger aircraft as the pilot maneuvered the refueling probe into the basket. The metallic clunk of the lock was followed by the immediate rush of high-pressure jet fuel into the helicopter's tanks. For 3 minutes, the 3 aircraft flew as a single, fragile entity, suspended between a hostile coast and an uncertain horizon. "Fuel transfer complete," the pilot reported, breaking away. As the helicopters peeled off to the south, a series of bright, white streaks arced over the northern horizon. Russian surface-to-air missiles fired blindly into the area where the USS Carney's jamming was most intense. The missiles self-destructed in the upper atmosphere, creating a mock aurora of silver light that reflected off the water. The crew of destructed atmosphere, reached 7-4, looked back one last time. The fires at Belbek were still visible, a small, angry orange glow on the edge of the fire world. They were alive, and the tech was destroyed, but the strategic landscape of the Black Sea had been permanently altered by the events of the last 3 hours. 9:30 in the evening on the 10th of April, 2026, Ramstein Air Base, Germany. The recovery flight, a KC-130J Super Hercules, taxied into a secluded hangar on the far western edge of the airfield, away from the prying eyes of the main terminal. As the 4 turboprop engines groaned into a final, heavy silence, the rear ramp lowered to reveal a cabin bathed in the cold, clinical glow of portable floodlights. The air inside the hangar was still, smelling of damp concrete and the faint, lingering exhaust of the transport. There were no cameras, no cheering crowds, and no official welcome, only a fleet of dark government sedans and a waiting medical team from the 86th Medical Group. The crew of Reach 7-4 descended the ramp. With the stiff, mechanical movements of people who had spent the last 6 hours in a state of sustained neurological shock. Major Elias Thorne was the last of the flight crew to emerge, his flight suit stained with dried blood and his eyes clouded by the dull ache of a grade 2 concussion sustained during the Tomahawk impact. Beside him, Captain Miller walked with a slight limp, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline withdrawal. They were alive, but the weight of the day was visible in the way they avoided the gaze of the intelligence officers waiting at the base of the ramp. The cost of the mission was already being tallied in a secure vault 3 floors beneath the base headquarters. The United States Air Force had officially struck the C-17 Globemaster 3, tail number 50141, from the active inventory. The aircraft, a $340 million strategic asset, remained on the Belbek tarmac as a blackened, skeletal ruin, its internal systems hollowed out by plasma charges and secondary fires. More significant was the loss of the Aegis-X frequency hopper. While the physical hardware had been vaporized, the fact that Russian electronic warfare units had successfully tethered the device meant the underlying quantum logic architecture was now compromised. Every secure radio and satellite link used by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would have to be re-encrypted, a logistical task that would take years and cost billions. The human cost was localized but deep. Sergeant Thomas Cale, the Marine raider who had taken the shrapnel during the insertion, was wheeled off the aircraft on a stretcher, his left shoulder a mass of gauze and surgical drains. He would retain his arm, but the nerve damage meant his career as an operator was likely over. The rest of the team sat on the edge of the hangar's concrete floor, their heads hanging low, the silence between them heavy with the realization of how close they had come to disappearing into a Russian detention facility. In these final hours, the clinical language of the A2 campaign report began to dissolve into a deeper, more troubling uncertainty. The mission had been called a success because the crew was home and the technology had not been captured whole. But that victory felt hollow against the cold reality of the Crimean night. The United States military had entered the engagement with an unshakable faith in its electronic invisibility, only to find that its most advanced shield had been turned into a homing beacon. The 0-4 intelligence assessment had not just been a failure of data, it had been a failure of imagination, a refusal to believe that the adversary could bridge the technological gap so decisively. As the hangar doors slowly hummed shut, cutting off the view of the rainy German runway, the true nature of the new era of warfare became to make clear. It was a landscape where the strongest signal was also the most vulnerable, and where the pride of a superpower could be grounded by a single hijacked frequency. Major Thorne looked back at the empty space where his aircraft should have been. The mission had achieved its immediate objective, but it had left something vital behind on that tarmac. It was the end of the illusion of technological invulnerability. The sky over the Black Sea was no longer a place where American power moved unseen. It was a theater where every ghost had a signature, and where the price of being noticed was the total loss of the mission. The hangar lights flickered off, leaving the crew in the shadows, waiting for a debriefing that would never quite explain how the invisible had become so easy to find.